I'll speak louder. He is the Associate Dean for Behavioral Health Integration and Community Care Transformation at the Geisinger Commonwealth School of Medicine, where he's also a professor of psychiatry. Prior to coming to Pennsylvania in 2018, it doesn't seem like that short a time ago. He was the Birnbaum Blum Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Connecticut, where he'd also been the chair of the Department of Psychiatry, followed by the Associate Dean. He had previously been at Dartmouth Medical School as the vice chair and medical director in psychiatry. And before that was a professor of psychiatry at the University of California, San Diego, where he was also the chief of psychiatry at the San Diego VA Medical Center, and subsequently the medical director of psychiatry in the Scripps Hospital system. He did his residency at UCSD. He has a background in psychopharmacology and been very active in health system planning and innovation. And more recently, his major effort was on resilience. And again, that's the topic of today's discussion. So thank you for coming, Dr. Huey.
Okay, thank you very much, John. So having been an English major, I always like to pass on books that I think are excellent. And one of the books is pictured above, and I can assure you it's thin, fast, easy to read. Chris has read the book upon recommendation, so kudos to you for that. But Benjamin Labatut, it's an interesting story. He is a Chilean writer, so born in Chile. His native language is Spanish. But he attended a British school in The Hague for 8 years. And what he found is that in his writing, English was a more persuasive language for him. He could express himself, he felt, better in English than in Spanish. So ironically, he writes in English and his books get translated back into Spanish for his native country. But this is a title that's pretty apt for this time in our history, when we cease to understand the world. And it is a cross between nonfiction and fiction. I happened to catch a review that he was doing, that was being done by the New York Review of Books. And he is a 40-something, charismatic, incredibly bright individual who is quite likable and not stuck up, no pretension there. He just kind of says it the way it is, which was kind of refreshing. So if you have inclination, this would be something to read. You could probably read it in a day, maybe 2. What do you think, Chris? 2 or 3 days. Okay. Okay. Not that you understand everything, because that's the title of the book. So let's see, this is supposed to advance. Okay, all right. So the title for the talk today is Resilience, AKA the Brilliance of Resilience. So that's part of my English background, kind of poetic license. So in healthcare, and so why is resilience brilliant? Well, in healthcare, we search for what's wrong, pathology, and the goal is to fix it. But resilience is about strength and promotion and protection. And the goal is how to learn what these attributes are, how they exist in individuals and communities, and take steps that are necessary to enhance this particular property of resilience. Here are my disclosures. I have none, except for one slight one. And the learning objectives, I think that they're spelled out there. Defining the concept of resilience, identifying the biopsychosocial aspects of resilience, evaluating the components of community resilience, and determine if an academic consortium collective can help NEPA become known as a community of resilience and what that might mean. And I have a model in mind for that. So 2 years ago, the question was posed, can NEPA become a community of resilience? So you know, COVID shut down most things before we could complete that work. But we had interest from a number of academic and non-academic areas. We had been working to add a neurobiological component to the psychosocial aspects of resilience. And we had assembled a number of academicians from around the country and locally who expressed interest in this project. And locally, this included Gabby Waite, David Avery, Brian Piper, Glenn Finney in neurology, and Peter Stewart in neuropsychology. But now that we're emerging, I think, from the COVID cave, we're recatalyzing the efforts. But at this point, focusing on higher education in Northeastern Pennsylvania. And I'll get into great detail on that in a minute. So we know from the literature that multiple systems can have overlapping interactions involving resilience that include the natural, built, and social environments, psychological systems, and biological systems. And I want to review some concepts in biology. Kind of homeostasis, the state of steady internal physical and chemical conditions maintained by living systems. That's the condition of optimal function. And allostasis, the process by which the body responds to stressors to regain homeostasis. And when there's incomplete homeostasis, a rebalancing, especially following repeated stress, leads to longer lasting maladaptive responses and either psychological and or physical dysfunction. So the simple definition of resilience is the ability to bounce back, to remain stable in the face of adversity. Resilience is not a trait, but a changing condition of one or more systems when exposed to stress. Individuals can be resilient to some things, but not to others. So this is the capacity, again, homeostasis, allostasis of a dynamic system to adapt successfully to disturbances that threaten system function. Those individuals or communities who do not succumb to stressors may have what have been described as protective factors. Now, I'm going to take an aside for a moment. It's related to resilience. But a little over 20 years ago, Felitti and Anda published work done at Kaiser in San Diego, studying women who were obese. And in their assessment, they noted that most of the women had experienced trauma of various types in childhood. This led to the work of Adverse Childhood Experiences that was first published in 1998. The study received a great deal of attention because the results seemed compelling. That simply totaling a score based upon adult retrospective reports could predict both physical and psychiatric problems in adulthood from childhood. Areas of focus were abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. It seemed straightforward and simple. And it was important because until the returning vets from Vietnam came back with PTSD, really little attention had been paid in a systematic way to what previously was characterized during the First World War as shell shock and war neurosis. So health systems picked up on adverse childhood experiences, and they inserted screens for ACEs into their health systems. However, ACEs seem to be a simple way to diagnose and treat. So what's the problem? Well, overstatements have been made that ACEs, for example, are responsible for major depression. Now, ACEs can contribute to depression and can result in depression, But ACEs are not responsible for all depressive illness that occurs. I was at a meeting where Felitti was presenting these data and made that statement, and we looked around at each other and said, did he really say that? Because we know that little weight can be placed on adults' retrospective reports of details of early experiences, or on reports that rely heavily on judgments or interpretation. What was overlooked and what had appeared in the literature previously and currently is that there are advantageous childhood experiences, counter ACEs, if you will, or protective factors that exist. ACEs are not deterministic. In fact, counter ACEs in adolescence may diminish the negative effects of ACEs during adult health and independently contribute to better health overall for some. So these are resilience factors that provide protection against the effects of adverse childhood experiences on risk for pathology. I want to go through just a list of some of the pioneers and powerhouses in the evolution of resilience science. Michael Rudder did his first study on the Isle of Wight in the 1960s and later in the Inner London study. This was the first longitudinal epidemiological study that began with kids 9 to 11 with periodic evaluations every few years into adulthood and included their parents. Norman Garmezy at the University of Minnesota noted unexpected positive variations in adaptive behavior and development along high-risk samples of children. And I want to read something about Garmezy to you. Norman Garmezy, a developmental psychologist and clinician at the University of Minnesota, met thousands of children in his 4 decades of research. But one boy in particular stuck with him. He was 9 years old with an alcoholic mother and an absent father. Each day he would arrive at school with the exact same sandwich, 2 slices of bread with nothing in between. At home, there was no other food available and no one to make any. Even so, Garmezy would later recall, the boy wanted to make sure that, quote, no one would feel pity for him and no one would know the ineptitude of his mother. Each day without fail, he would walk in with a smile on his face and a bread sandwich tucked into his bag. The boy with the bread sandwich was part of a special group of children. He belonged to a cohort of kids, the first of many whom Garmezy would go on to identify as succeeding, even excelling, despite incredibly difficult circumstances. These were the children who exhibited a trait Garmezy would later identify as resilience. He is widely credited with being the first to study the concept in an experimental setting. Over many years, Garmezy would visit schools across the country, focusing on those in economically depressed areas and follow a standard protocol. He would set up meetings with the principal along with a school social worker or nurse and pose the same question. Were there any children whose backgrounds had initially raised red flags? Kids who seemed likely to become problem kids, who had instead become, surprisingly, a source of pride. What he was saying was, can you identify stressed children who are making it here in your school? Garmezy said in a 1999 interview, there would be a long pause after my inquiry before the answer came. If I had said, do you have kids in this school who seem to be troubled, there wouldn't have been a moment's delay. But to be asked about children who were adaptive and good citizens in the school and making it even though they had come out of very disturbed backgrounds, that was a new sort of inquiry. That's the way we began. Resilience presents a challenge for us. Whether you can be said to have it or not largely depends not on any particular psychological test, but on the way your life unfolds. It's only when you're faced with obstacles, stress, and other environmental threats that resilience or the lack of it emerges. Do you succumb or do you surmount? Anne Maston inherited a lot of attributes from Norm Garmezy, who's now deceased. She's at the University of Minnesota. She continued and expanded on the work of Garmezy, Rutter, and others on resilience factors that provide protection against the effects of adverse childhood experiences on psychological and physical risk. And she introduced the current concept of multi-system resilience. Katie McLaughlin recently moved from the University of Washington to Harvard. Her focus is on also protections and buffers against risk. Bruce McEwen at Rockefeller University, a neuroscientist, he studied and found that toxic stress atrophies neurons. And he coined the phrase allostatic load. Michael Unger from Canada has done multiple longitudinal studies in moderate and high income countries around the concept of resilience. And Jack Shonkoff at Harvard in his Center on the Developing Child has been studying critical periods, which I'll focus on in a moment. So resilience is a multi-system phenomenon influenced by genetics, stress hormones, neurotransmitter systems, family, friends, school, and society. So Shonkoff gave a lecture to the Harvard School of Education in 2018. And this is a slide that he showed. The black box is the infant. And there are multiple factors that impact the black box infant. Stressors, parents, genes, and protective factors. And from that, depending upon the degree, how much of all those four aspects contribute to the infant, there's a continuum. There can be individuals who emerge with strong skills, healthy behaviors, physical and mental well-being, or at the other end of the continuum can be kids reflected by school failure, risky behaviors, chronic illness, and shorter lifespan. So I want to now go through resilience as viewed from the biopsychosocial perspective. So from the neurobiology perspective, we know that early life stress can accelerate the maturation of fear circuits. So the window for neuroplasticity closes faster when infants are exposed to stress. In 2-month-old infants, more stressful events lead to lower EEG power. And there's intense search going on for neurobiological markers, pro-inflammatory cytokines, looking at the microbiome, and heart rate variability, which Gabby Wade and David Avery have been studying intensively because that may be a very good marker for certainly physical resilience and perhaps psychological resilience as well. So we know about the locus coeruleus and its function. We think in terms of norepinephrine. It's involved in learned behaviors, spatiotemporal integration. It integrates input from multiple stress responses to promote vigilance and anxiety. The nucleus accumbens, and I don't know if there's no pointer here, I guess, but the nucleus accumbens may constitute a circuit where resilience-specific homeostasis is balanced by excitatory and inhibitory potassium channel circuits to maintain stable behaviors. The nucleus accumbens is the neural interface between motivation and action. The amygdala. Children exposed to threat have reduced amygdala and hippocampal volume and heightened activation to threat. So the amygdala is involved in decision making. Its main job is to regulate and encode. It regulates and encodes memories and its main job is to regulate emotions such as fear and aggression. It supports flexible cognition and social behaviors. And the hippocampus, involved in learning and memory, it's plastic and vulnerable. Resilience is viewed from psychology. The psychosocial perspective defines resilience in terms of three key processes: the biological, which is predisposition and temperament; psychological, coping skills, self-concept, and resourcefulness; and social, healthy relationships and social support. And there are a list of protective factors that have been identified. But the two most important protective factors at the bottom and in bold and asterisk are a stable and supportive relationship with a significant adult and a caring family environment. Now, I've been talking about resilience as if, well, this is something that we really need to focus on in kids in order to set the stage for adulthood. But resilience enhancement can occur in adults as well, and I'm going to get to that in a moment. Resilience is viewed from the social perspective. Poverty shrinks children's brains. Less gray matter, less cortical surface area. Socioeconomic status influences language, visual spatial skills, memory, and cognitive flexibility. Helping children and adolescents develop healthy relationships with family, community, and school may lead to improved health in adulthood, even in the presence of poverty and childhood adversity. And the index study that showed that it was possible to change what was happening to kids was the Perry Preschool Study in Ypsilanti, Michigan. There, children, babies, toddlers, 3 to 4, were studied with incredible resources available to them and their families. I think the size of the classes were maximized at 8, and the kids were exposed to all kinds of resilience enhancing exercises over time. And they followed these kids into their 40s. And they found great differences between those kids who went through the Perry Preschool model versus those kids who did not. And that's an interesting study by itself. Now, for a moment, I'm going to continue to talk a little bit about the neurobiology of resilience. And this was an edition that came out of Biological Psychiatry in 2019. And some of you may have seen in a recent article in the New York Times, do genes protect some from COVID? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that's been done at Eric Nestler's lab at Sinai. Eric Nestler is the Dean for Academic Affairs at Sinai. He has been president of the Society for Neuroscience. He's done incredible work in genes, depression, and addiction. So the social defeat model has a mouse that is placed in physical contact with an aggressor mouse a few minutes a day. And the two are separate. That's on the left-hand side there. And the two are then separated by a screen for the rest of the day, allowing visual and sensory cues to occur between the two. The non-aggressor mouse shows behaviors interpreted as being stressed out, mouse PTSD, if you will, and depression. And the pattern, as described, is repeated for 10 days. Most mice exhibit behaviors viewed as compatible with depression in humans, but a third of the mice do not, leading to efforts to understand what makes them different. So resilient mice show an additional set of changes. And here is a diagram that tries to explain this. Is there a pointer here, Keith? I think you can make this out, but I just use that. Okay. All right. So susceptible mice are exposed to stress, and the potassium channel is open, and potassium flow is limited, but it's limited. And to some extent, this counteracts brain dopamine activity. Susceptible mice have upregulation of genes, but compared to resilient mice, they have more genes are regulated. Resilient mice have potassium channel openers too, but the flow of potassium through those openings is greater. And it's more effective in counteracting the brain hyperactivity caused by dopamine. So more genes are regulated in the resilient mice. There's a higher rate of firing in neurons, and the resilient mice are relatively unaffected. There's no mouse PTSD or depression. So global gene expression is different in resilient versus susceptible mice. For every 100 genes that changed up or down in susceptible mice, 300 genes change in resilient mice. Resilient animals show greater adaptation in response to adversity. The modulation of potassium channels in the dopamine neurons appear to relate to which animals are resilient and which are susceptible. And these channels are believed to be active mediators of resilience. The modulations of these potassium channels can occur through potassium channel openers. So resilient mice use more ion channels, including actively regulating several potassium channels to stabilize dopamine neurons. So the new concept is that resilience is an active stress coping process by which resilient individuals homeostatically maintain healthy behaviors through activation of more potassium ion channels. The first open label trial on 20 humans with depression using frutagabine, which is a new FDA-approved anticonvulsant that targets potassium channels, is underway at Sinai. And the lead author, Han, has just published the results of that initial pilot study that has shown that this particular potassium channel opener improves depression. In another study, mindfulness training has been shown to increase the structure of the hippocampus. And we can speculate why that might be important. I want to shift now to some data from the Commonwealth Fund. The Commonwealth Fund group is an apolitical group of scientists, kind of like high priests and priestesses, who study healthcare. And so this is their 2021 report, which they entitle Reflecting Poorly. So let's see what they mean by reflecting poorly. Here are the healthcare system rankings of industrialized nations. And we can see on the far right where the US falls. Overall, 11th out of the entire group, with the exception of care process number 2. And here are the performance scores with the US, where it is way over on the right and down. Now, many of you may be aware of these data, but if you're not, to me, when I have been looking at the Commonwealth Fund information over a number of years now, it gets my attention. Similar for equity, US is again at the bottom of these comparators. And I love this little picture from our friends in Canada, a civilized country. The difference between equality and equity, I think it makes the case quite well. And affordability. Again, the US is where it shows. The Commonwealth Fund also took a look at the states, and if I could get this pointer over here. I think that you want to be at least at this line, US average. These states down here toward the bottom are states that did not follow Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act. So that was interesting. And here's another way to look at the top states. You want to have the 5 areas of measurement primarily be in the white. And if you're in the dark area, well, you're in the dark area. But you can see the top states: Hawaii, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Iowa, Connecticut, Colorado, Vermont, Washington, Utah, New York, New Hampshire, and Wisconsin. They also do a local scorecard. They break the country into 306 areas. And on the left are the top 10 cities or areas. In the middle are the bottom 10. I don't think you want to have your healthcare in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And I pulled out the sites in Pennsylvania. And you can see where Danville is, number 76, where Scranton is, number 151, where Wilkes-Barre is, 166. And healthcare spending as a percentage of GDP, again, the red line is the US, and these are 2019 data, significantly higher than the rest of the comparator group. And based on Don Berwick's very interesting article from 2012, approximately a third of the anticipated 3+ trillion US healthcare cost is waste. So you can imagine, what could you do with $1 trillion in savings if you could? You can't get rid of all waste, but if you could get rid of some of that, what could you do with that? And then, humbling to me is that only 20% of health is determined by healthcare. And I think of an article I read some time ago that less than 30% of people understand what their doctor says to them, which is pretty amazing. And it gets into, how do we communicate with the patients that we see? The other thing here that's mentioned is your zip code is as important as your genetic code. So who coined that? Well, Tony Eaton, who's Canadian, did his undergraduate at McGill. He majored in neurophysiology, I think. He went to Hopkins Medical School, and the first day that he was there, a resident took him around the surrounding areas outside of the medical school, which were primarily blighted slum areas. And Tony said to the resident, "What is this?" And the resident said, "Well, that's just the way it is." Now that had kind of a sinking impression on Tony. He finished medical school at Hopkins and then did his postgraduate training in internal medicine and preventive medicine at Cornell, and then Yale. And sometime he took a break and went to California and got his JD from Cal Berkeley, and then subsequently his MPH. He worked, after he finished all that, as the medical director for the county of Alameda. And he would see coroner's reports coming in, and he got interested in taking a look at zip codes. where these deaths were occurring. And he noticed a big difference between affluent zip codes and not affluent zip codes. And so he coined the concept of your zip code is as important as your genetic code. And here is something again from the Commonwealth study showing that clinical care, as I said earlier, accounts for about 20%. The rest is physical environment, housing, transit, social determinants for sure, social and economic factors, education, employment, income, health behaviors. But this figure of 20% is certainly interesting. And this is a prelude to what I'm going to be talking about next, which is the Resilience Project. So the concept originally 2 years ago was, can NEPA become known as a community of resilience? Could the Resilience Project, linking with academia, with the community, and all the components of the community, become an academic and economic engine for NEPA, much in the way that the Framingham Heart Study has been in Massachusetts for the past 70 years. When we think of heart disease, coronary artery disease, we think of Framingham. 2 years ago, they got a $36 million grant to study heart disease in older populations. And that's just one small piece of the pie. They have brought in millions into that community. And that's the model that I'm talking about. So could this project be initiated and led by higher education? Could the small colleges and universities in this region, along with the medical school and existing collaborators, become a collective integrated academic engine around concepts of individual and community resilience? Could an integrated shared curriculum in resilience science and resilience enhancement be developed across NEPA at collaborating institutions at undergraduate, graduate, and postgraduate levels? Would doing so create resilience diffusion into other areas of the community? Could the collective focus on resilience science and enhancement become a hallmark for the region? So when one mentions NEPA, one thinks of resilience. So we had interest in 2020 from the following institutions and organizations at provost and president levels, which is, I think, a pretty good scan of the colleges and universities in NEPA. We also had meetings with Head Start, Early Head Start, and we got some inquiry from the Blue Zone group. We developed what we called affinity groups, kind of 12 areas that could be concentration areas for the community and for the academic community, including the administration, communication, resilience enhancement, genomics, activity tracking, brain function and neuropsychology, population health. I won't read all of those, but it covers all the components that could go into making a project of this viable. And we had worked out a battery for individual resilience assessment, working with a California group who would be providing the genomics, the blood work, activity tracking, things like that. Kind of deciding, well, this could be an individual assessment of a certain cohort of individuals. And the thought was linking the psychosocial aspects of resilience with the neurobiological across the lifespan. Could resilience enhancement improve outcomes in disease states, reduce morbidity, and potentially reduce costs of healthcare? Could resilience enhancement improve self-esteem, self-confidence, and success? Could we arrive at a resilience profile? One of our collaborators, Dina Davis, who is an ethicist at Lehigh, sent me this note. He said, well, the Resilience Project is an exciting opportunity to push the boundaries of what we know about human flourishing and to benefit humanity in a number of ways. If we know more about what fosters resilience in the face of adversity, we can help people who are less resilient become more so. We can assist children in becoming resilient adults, and we can design social, economic, and physical environments in ways that support resilience. But she adds, because resilience is an intuitively accessible concept, it is also easy for the public to adopt simplistic versions of a complex reality. Just as was seen with the Human Genome Project, there are dangers in resilience essentialism and in forces that, you can't read the last part of this research in discriminatory and non-beneficial ways. So there are individual and community behaviors that are intertwined that might be modified to promote resilience. And you can read the list: optimism, cognitive reappraisal, active coping, social support, humor, physical exercise. And if you go onto the website, the internet, and look up the American Psychological Association and put in resilience, you'll see a list of about 20 or 25 characteristics that are believed associated with resilience. And then you'll find another list of about the same length of ways to operationalize those concepts into actual teaching and learning. Resilience and coping mechanisms, that's kind of close to what I was talking about in the last slide. Affective labeling, naming your feelings, cognitive reappraisal, psychological flexibility, developing the ability to adapt, pursuing one's values, and using mindfulness to break the cycle of disruptive thought processes. Now, what attracts people to a community? Well, there are certainly positive factors: green spaces, quality of education, thoughtful city planning. And I believe that there are some representatives from the mayor's office in virtual here. Reduction of blight. I think the mayor has reestablished a blight committee. When I first came here, I invited myself to be on that committee, but being from outside, I don't think I was accepted because of that, but I was interested. Public health initiatives such as smoking cessation, food health, exercise health. Springboard, which has to do with literacy. Pride of community, friendliness, transportation ease, quality of roads, priorities. Economic health and development opportunities, housing, safety, and vibrancy is what makes a community interesting. Negative factors, and some of these are primarily mine: corruption and its effect on pride and morale. So when I see people dumping their auto cigarette ashtrays into the parking lot of a grocery store, I'm thinking, what does that reflect? What does that reflect in terms of pride of community in that particular individual? So that's kind of attitude. Crime, neon, I put in neon. Is there a sense of community confusion and helplessness and surrender? And truck routes through the middle of towns and cities. And so I think those of you who live here know about the plant. I forgot where the plant is, out toward Tuckhannock, is that right? Where the projected number of trucks rolling through Clark Summit, and I presume through the middle of Scranton, will be 400 trucks a day. I think that's what I read. That's not going to contribute to vibrancy. And certainly racism is another factor. Now, there have been groups that have started to look at what's required for building resilient communities. Well, the Urban Land Institute has come up with this list: understanding vulnerabilities, strengthening job and housing opportunities, promoting equity, building the business case, accurately pricing the cost of inaction, designing with natural systems, harnessing innovation and technology. The Rockefeller Foundation describes 7 qualities that define and demonstrate resilient cities: reflectiveness, resourcefulness, robustness, redundancy, flexibility, inclusiveness, and integration. And all of these factors that are laid out here, scattered on this page or this slide, are factors that at some level need to be connected if a community is going to promote resilience and the population is going to respond to that. The Gensler Research Institute has identified resilient cities, and it notes resilient cities begin with resilient people. And then this comment about, does private virtue beget civic virtue, which comes out of a biography of Benjamin Franklin by Walter Isaacson, who's saying that, well, Benjamin Franklin had the capacity to operationalize his private virtue into civic virtue. So vibrant communities, from primarily urban development, Nashville, Southwest Baltimore, Oklahoma City, Brooklyn, Queens, and Richmond. So the question is, resilient science and academia, is that a new field of study? And in conceptualizing the issue of resilience, I think that there are many different components associated with resilience, from the psychosocial, education, healthcare, ethics, philosophy, spirituality, health, community health, neuroscience. And there's plenty there for institutions and people to engage around. So, and there are probably other things that I haven't thought of that pertain to resilient science. So we are organizing a colloquium for the fall of 2022 or the spring of 2023 along the theme, can NEPA become known as a community of resilience? We've invited 3 keynote speakers: Mark Holder at the University of British Columbia, whose area is wellness, he is accepted; Ann Maston, I previously mentioned, at the University of Minnesota; and Jack Shonkoff at Harvard University. We would like a planning committee from participating colleges and universities in NEPA and partners. So the questions to conclude, almost conclude, is this a sufficiently unique project for consideration by higher education and community partners in NEPA? Can individuals from interested systems come together to discuss details and serve as a planning committee for the colloquium? Can we begin to discuss areas of interest, perhaps using the affinity group model discussed previously? Can institutions and organizations identify individuals to serve on a resilience planning group to develop philosophy, strategy, and direction? Can efforts at resilience enhancement be developed on each of your campuses and within partner organizations? Can we begin to identify potential funding sources for both the colloquium and some of the specific assessments and interventions mentioned in the resilience project? This is already underway. I note this is not a 5 or 10-year or even 20-year project. This is a collaborative community effort, which, if successful, could be transformational. Research and system opportunities for faculty, students, and the community would be part of this. The challenge is, just to name a few, the academic systems are being asked to collaborate, which at some level they already do, but they are also competitors. The development of shared curricula and resilience enhancement strategies will take time and likely tedious planning and dialogue to arrive at a focused platform that can be operationalized. Institutional and organizational representatives would need to return to their respective systems for future deliberation and likely development of concepts and plans specific to their systems. So The question is, next steps. I know that there are a number of representatives virtually here today. I've raised the questions. There are some handouts, and we'll make the presentation available to people who are virtually online. How should we proceed? And there is a selected bibliography that I've included. And the last slide is something I ask medical students when I rotate with them. So, in medical school, for fortunately or unfortunately, we sometimes learn by mnemonics. And so this is a mnemonic. Every shiksa from Zanzibar makes potato latkes. You can play with that and consider what that is. And if anybody knows, people will most likely say, well, this must be something psychiatric. It's not psychiatric. Any answers? We have a couple medical students in here today. Do they know the answer? And I tell them if they get the answer right to that, then they don't have to take the shelf exam. Okay. Any questions before we stop? I think I'm almost over time. Well, I'm not over time yet. Okay. I tried to hurry through this so that there would be time for questions. Are they introduced by what? The mouse research group in Maine has developed an aggressor mouse model. And we call that particular model the antisocial mouse model. And this particular mouse is bigger than the other mice and is put in the cage with the kind of the run-of-the-mill mouse. So the question is this acute stress? Is that the question? I would say that for the mouse, for the susceptible mouse, that's an acute stress that's going on. Because the aggressor mouse will beat up on the smaller mouse. So I think that's the definition of acute stress for that mouse. Okay, any other questions?
I'm just wondering if this analogy.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to. No, I haven't seen that, no. To the model. Mhm.
Look at this from a strengths model. What are the strengths? Build resilience.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Looking at the concepts in your whole diagram like this.
Yep.
What are the strengths that you would see that our community should be? In addition to addressing the deficits that you pointed out.
Well, that's a moving target, certainly, because the whole issue of what is resilience is something that has yet to be defined fully. And in terms of this model of studying a community and using the power of the academic institutions to come together and define, well, what are the strengths at play here? That to me is the interesting part of the process. The protective factors that are listed that I mentioned earlier about high intelligence, socialization, capacity for warmth, things like that, those would be kind of starting points, I think, in assessing, well, what are the strengths of individuals and how would we measure the inherent strengths of particular individuals. There are rating scales that have evolved around for assessing resilience. And so they include a number of the strengths that I think are listed under protective factors. But to me, I think that those in academic systems that have interest in this concept and its application to the larger community, I think that is like a good playpen, in essence, for people to really think creatively and hard about, well, what are we trying to do here? And that whole process of engagement with one another is what I see as part of the richness of what's being proposed.
Once that's evaluated by one of these measures, then as the research says, okay, this is how we can enhance this protective factor, either in an individual or in a community.
Yes, we would want to measure that. And I think I was saying earlier, resilience enhancement is not just applied to kids. The US military is training soldiers in the concept of resilience. So, and so they believe that resilience can be improved upon. And if that's the case, does that get back to resilient cities are populated by resilient individuals? So there's a connection here that I think is, we can conjecture about.
I think, you know, when I was looking at that slide of resiliency with the multiple spokes, that's very similar to discussions on what wellness in a community looks like as well. So there's that overlay. I think one of the issues that we say is that as I look at the resiliency project, we're also doing a parallel project with looking at genomics, looking at all those pieces. So I think at a certain point, it's crossing that academic and social service divide and government divide. I think that could be one of the strengths, that there are various things going on, maybe not coordinated at this point. Are some strengths in the community.
Yeah, well, wellness is obviously very closely related to resilience and vice versa. So wellness, physical and mental health, well-being, basically. Resilience is, well, how do you maintain that in the face of adversity? Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.